Good afternoon. I hope that you're doing well. Welcome to week 2 of COM 330, Are You Listening? This week, we'll be developing on the ideas that we talked about last week, not only understanding what listening is, but also thinking about what it means to be a good listener. So, like with last week, I'll be going over some of the major slides and things to know. As a reminder, this week you'll be turning in a quiz that covers content from the week's readings by Sunday. And then you'll also be completing week 2's activity. Some of you have already finished that, but this activity will go over some of the major ideas that relate to this chapter, including ways to be an effective listener. So let's go ahead and get started. So the goals, again, for this week are to understand some of the barriers and issues that can impact good listening, some of the habits, including the bad habits that we might develop for listening skills, as well as some of the ways that we can develop good, active listening that lets us be attentive to the various challenges that we deal with in our lives. So one thing to think back about and reflect on from last week is the idea that listening is more than just picking up on something with our ears, right? Listening is essentially a 5-step process. We have to receive and take in the information. We have to interpret and make sense of the information in our own words. We have to recall and remember that information for later. We have to evaluate and critically think about whether or not the information we receive is true. And we have to respond, give some type of feedback to the message that shows that the person we're talking to is actually delivering that message to us and that we can listen to them. So if you think about those 5 stages, there's a lot of things that can go wrong in each of those stages, right? For instance, maybe we don't get the information correctly. Maybe there's noise or disruption that impacts the message. Maybe we don't interpret the message properly because we're tired and can't make sense of it. Maybe we can't remember or recall somebody's name. Maybe we're not able to evaluate the message and we take a satirical message and think that it's honest. Or we don't pick up on sarcasm in a message. Or maybe we don't respond to a message in the way that we should. Maybe we cut somebody else off while they're speaking. At any rate, we can see that there are some barriers and challenges that we feel in every stage of that process. One of the biggest barriers for good listening is physical noise. So if you're walking down the street and there's a really loud jackhammer that's going off and is disrupting your listening, for instance, talking to a friend and no longer being able to hear them correctly, that would be the use of physical noise as a barrier to good listening skills. Again, a lot of times we can't control that, but it can definitely make that process, especially of receiving information, more difficult. But it can affect our ability to process and recall that information too. Secondarily, we can have physiological noise. If you have a really bad headache or migraine and it's ringing in your head and meaning that you just can't go through the day, that physiological noise is going to make it a lot harder for you to do your daily tasks. Psychological noise. If you've ever read or watched or heard of Winnie the Pooh, there's the character Eeyore, who often has like a cloud of rain over his head and has a very pessimistic outlook on life. In this way, Eeyore has psychological noise, right? He has this sad, depressed outlook on life that affects the ways that he thinks about and listens. If Winnie the Pooh is saying that it's a great day outside, he says, well, I don't know. Maybe there'll be rain. So in that way, psychological noise is how your own mood, your outlook on life, and so on is going to impact how you receive and understand a message. So these are some of the major barriers to think about, but there's other elements here too that can also prevent us from being able to receive messages in the ways that we should. One of them is the idea that there's a major gap between our speaking and our thinking. If you're talking to somebody and you notice as they're talking that you find your mind drifting or you're focusing on other things, that's oftentimes because we think a lot faster than we speak. So if somebody else is talking, our brain is running past that and starting to think about different issues. So one of the challenges for effective listening is to bring our brains back and try to refocus on the conversation, even though we might be starting to think about other topics. There's some other barriers too that can impact good listening, and I want to take some time to go over them in a little bit more detail. One of them is the idea of selective attention. For instance, pictured here is a woman reading a book, and there's a lot of noise and problems going on. There's people playing music, there's somebody on their phone, there's a dog barking, there's a truck going by. And so given that, we can understand that selective attention is a way of dealing with and addressing those issues. Selective attention allows her to focus on reading the book, despite some of those challenges and barriers that she might be encountering. So selective attention allows us to focus on major issues and topics that are important to us. But selective attention can also mean that we're dipping in and out of the topic in a way that doesn't make sense or prevents us from fully understanding the message. For instance, selective attention might mean that we're only paying attention to part of the conversation, or that we miss the main point of a conversation with somebody else. Another issue that can affect our ability to respond to a message effectively is what's called response preparation. If you've ever seen something like a presidential debate, you'll notice that oftentimes the candidates are not really listening to each other very well. In fact, they spend most of the time preparing and thinking about a response to what the other person is saying. If you're about to be called on for an assignment or for a group discussion, oftentimes you're going to be using that time to mentally prepare and think through what you're going to tell your instructor. So in this way, response preparation is about listening for the sake of anticipating and responding to a message. In that way, you're dedicating your mental energy not toward listening and really trying to understand the other person, because if you've ever seen a presidential debate, they don't really understand each other very well. But it is about trying to figure out what to say in response to somebody. Another concern and a key idea in listening is that it's a two-way street. Listening is not just about you picking up on and getting the message. The person sending the message has a responsibility to create a message that's listenable. If you're about to watch somebody give a big presentation and it turns out their microphone is turned off, then that's on them. You're not going to be able to listen or understand them in the way that you should because they haven't messaged correctly. So that can be a barrier too. And there is responsibility on the person speaking to do so in a more respectful way. And then lastly is the idea of prejudiced listening. You can think about it as putting up a shield or putting up a wall as you're listening to somebody. For instance, if you significantly disagree with somebody's political or social views and they start to disclose them to you, you might find that the instant that you disagree with them, you're putting a wall up or you're closing off some of the ways that you might otherwise listen. So prejudiced listening can definitely be a problem too, especially if we find ourselves disagreeing with somebody on various issues. In addition to that, there's also various practices that we do that could be considered bad listening. And I'd like to spend some time going over some of these strategies in a little bit more detail. Chances are you or somebody that you've known has done at least one of these before. The first idea here is pseudo-listening. Pseudo-listening is the idea that we pretend to listen and we give nonverbal feedback that doesn't really line up with the actual message. If you're talking to somebody and you say, I was going to the store today, and then I saw, like somebody cuts off with nonverbal response that doesn't make sense for the sentence, that's pseudo-listening. It's using nonverbal signals to pretend that you know the message and are following along, but it doesn't quite line up. Sometimes we use pseudo-listening in a way that actually tricks the other person and makes them think that we're really listening to them. Secondarily is narcissistic listening. If you're familiar with the Greek story of Narcissus, he looked in the mirror and was so fond of his own image, right? He died and became a flower, Narcissus. So narcissistic listening is self-obsessed listening. It's listening just to focus on yourself or the ways that the message is impacting you. So if you're with a group of people and you're listening to them talk and they're trying to talk about, what they did over the weekend, maybe you only really care about how you did over the weekend and you're only really listening to things that impact you. Aggressive listening, right, is when you're listening to attack somebody else. So maybe you're in an argument with somebody and you say, I really think you should take the trash down. And they respond by saying, you always want me to take the trash down. right? It's not really listening to understand, it's listening to attack the point that the other person is trying to make. Eavesdropping is different than overhearing a conversation, right? Eavesdropping is intentional. It's doing something like putting a glass next to a wall to try to hear what the other person is saying, or physically trying to line up so that you can see somebody else. If you've watched a show or movie that has wiretapping, right, as a strategy to pick up on private conversations, that's eavesdropping. So it's bad listening because the conversation is not meant for that person. And it's a very specific and intentional way to disrupt a private conversation. And then lastly is distorted listening. And this is an issue with our ability to receive and make sense of our information. Distorted listening means that we mishear or misunderstand the message. And it can be as simple as just getting it wrong. Maybe we don't hear it properly. Maybe, for instance, somebody says, I live on 5th, and you thought that they said, I live on 6th. Something like that just means that we haven't heard the message properly, and therefore we might not recall the message properly. Again, if we're careless and not paying attention to a message, then distorted listening is our responsibility. There's a lot of ways that that can impact the entire listening process. So these are some of the ways that we do listening poorly. But there's also a lot of different ways that we can improve our listening at each stage. Your textbook goes over some of these in more detail, but I would like to outline some of the major ways to focus on developing good listening skills. At the receiving end, it's making sure you have an environment in which the message can be clearly heard and understood, that maybe you're eliminating outside distractions and that you have a place to focus. For instance, moving into another room or turning your audio up. Interpreting is using things like context to make sense of the message. If somebody said, I went to drafting school, and you know that they're an architect, right? You would know that they're going to school to become an architect. And that drafting in that situation would not mean military. So interpreting means using the context and using the rules that we have for language in a way that makes sense. Recalling is a challenge, right? Repetition is the mother of skill. If you've taken a foreign language class, you know that repetition is really important to recall and remember things for the future. A mnemonic device is a really great way to try to remember information. Last week, I talked about the 3 hecks of source credibility: who the heck wrote it, when the heck was it written, and who the heck paid for it, right? Those are ways to remember. And then working on message retention, repeating the message to yourself, making the message significant to you, and so on. For instance, in some classes, I'll do a little activity where I ask people to share their name and then share food that they like that begins with the same letter as their first name. So for instance, my name is Ben and I like blueberries. That helps me to recall the names of other people. Evaluating is separating facts and assessing messages, right? So to be a good evaluator, you have to figure out where are the facts coming from, where are the sources, and are they credible? So it's really taking apart and really analyzing the messages. At EOU, there's courses offered in things like critical listening and argumentative writing that are really great ways to understand and explore these topics further, including in English and writing. And then responding, right? You can ask questions for clarification. You can show feedback that's appropriate and makes sense to the situation. If somebody is really pouring their heart out to you, you're probably not going to give a lot of nonverbal feedback, but you are going to do a lot of eye contact. So responding and then responding appropriately for the situation is something we can develop through good listening. A key idea here in good listening is the idea of active listening. You might be familiar with this, but this is something that in this class we're trying to develop a little bit more. It means that we are learning and understanding our messages well, and that we're also doing positive cognitive practices too, that our brains are picking up on information in a good way. So we're constantly learning about how to be better listeners. Active listening means that we take steps that at every stage attempt to make the message as understood as possible. So for instance, it means addressing the barriers. What are the goals or the things that we're trying to get by listening to this person? For instance, getting to know them and understanding them better. That might motivate us to follow along and hear their conversation. Secondarily, understanding how their messages relate to my life. That can be a challenging divide with narcissistic listening, but if you find a way to make somebody's message personally meaningful to you, that can be a great way to incorporate active listening. You might hear somebody talk about their challenges with going to school and think, wow, this person has dealt with a really relatable experience. I understand some of the challenges that they're going through. And then also be thinking about the type of listening and style of listening that makes sense. Again, if somebody really wants to talk to you, you might use less feedback and really show that you're listening. But if you're having an active and lively conversation, maybe feedback's more normal. Basically, at its core, a major goal for active listening is to motivate yourself to understand and follow the message the whole way through, especially knowing that we tend to think a lot more quickly than we speak. So that can help us to really follow the messages fully. Another way that can help us to develop good messages is dealing with internal dialogue. And that, again, deals with the idea that as we're listening to a message, there's a lot of thoughts and things buzzing in our heads. One way to do that is covert coaching, saying focus on the person in order to improve your listening or to redirect you. Another strategy might be self-reinforcement, where you say, I'm doing a good job of listening, I just need to keep at it. And then covert questioning is asking yourself questions to refocus your listening. Remind me again, what was that person's name? Oh yeah, right? In your head, you might start to ask yourself questions to make sure you understand and are able to pick up on the message. So that questioning is a way to test yourself as you're working through and listening to another person. Because we think faster than we speak, these strategies can help us to refocus and take the mental time to really dive into the message if we find ourselves getting a little off track. And then one of the last things to take away from this week is the context, again, matters. The situation in which somebody speaks is really important. And this is something that we'll get into in a little bit more detail when we start to talk about the role of culture in communication. But one thing to know here is that a low context culture, that is one that has direct communication and not a lot of kind of smaller social cues that an outsider wouldn't understand, is one situation in which good, direct, clear communication matters. Whereas in a high context culture, there might be more unspoken rules or guidelines that impact how people choose to speak and listen. For instance, if somebody's speaking and you disagree with them, in somewhere like the US, it might be more appropriate to say no. Whereas in another country like Japan, it might be more appropriate to say maybe or to say yes more hesitantly to indicate that you don't fully agree. So in that way, we have to think about how we adapt our own listening and responses to messages in ways that make sense with what we know about another culture and its people. So that wraps up this week. Again, looking at the barriers and the challenges of effective listening, as well as the steps and strategies that we can use to become good, active, and effective listeners. For next week, we'll be looking at the ways that media shape listening, focusing on the idea that listening, as we know through things like online classes, Zoom, FaceTime, and other forms of social media, have drastically changed the way that we listen and understand the world. So I look forward to getting more into detail about all of that with you. Again, please complete this week's quiz and activity on Canvas, and also make sure you're responding to at least one introduction by this Sunday. Have a great week, and I look forward to talking to you again next Monday.